Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with me, Mr. Snyder, and today we begin a new topic around the turn of the century into the 1900s, and we're going to begin talking about the progressive movement. We've had all of these problems we've talked about for the last couple of topics, and now we're going to start talking about solutions. So the learning targets today are to compare progressivism to populism and why progressivism lasts, talk about the role that journalists and novelists play in the progressive movement, some of the social reforms that progressives tackle, and we'll explain why progressives and what they hope to achieve through the political reform. So there are a bunch of social problems from the Gilded Age that need fixing. The immigrants, the tenement housing, the unsafe workplaces, all of this brought benefits and new social problems. So the progressivists believe that new ideas and honest and efficient government can bring about the social justice needed to fix these problems. They hope to solve problems in all sorts of areas like government, business, social welfare, and different labor conditions. It's made up of people from all political parties, social classes, ethnic groups, and religions. So unlike populism, which was workers and farmers, progressivism are these middle-class people who believe that educated leaders should use these modern ideas that we have about science to improve society. Both of these movements are reform movements, meaning they want to bring about change. They both want to get rid of corrupt government officials and eliminate big business abuses. These journalists were key in bringing about social change because they need to get the word out to people about what the problems are. Theodore Roosevelt, the president at the time, coins the phrase and calls them muckrakers. A muckrake is a tool used to clean manure and hay out of stables, and he calls them the muckrakers of the world because they write about the need for reform, and they go into all of these horrible places and talk about how awful they are. So they're socially conscious journalists who wrote about the need for reform. Some famous muckrakers we've already talked about: Jacob Riis, who writes about the horrible conditions in tenement housing and how the other half lives. There's Lincoln Steffens, who writes and exposes all of the government corruption in his book, The Shame of the Cities. And Ida Tarbell shows the true side of John Rockefeller and the oil industry in History of Standard Oil, and just how ruthless he was and cutthroat and using tactics to crowd other businesses out of his market so that he could have it all. There's also people who wrote fiction during this time, and these are called the naturalist novelists. And these naturalist novelists portray human misery and struggle. Upton Sinclair is probably the most famous. He writes The Jungle. We'll talk more about him in a second. Frank Norris's The Octopus is about Southern California wheat farmers and the railroad companies that have so much power over them. The Jungle is a naturalist novel which portrays human misery through fiction, so it's kind of historical fiction. This particular book is about the story of immigrants living in the slums of Chicago and working in the stockyards, where they keep animals and slaughter meat, and the disgusting details of rats, spoiled meat, and unsanitary conditions in these plants pretty much make America sick to their stomach. And so after this book is released, Congress passes the nation's first laws that regulate meat, food, and the drug industries. And Upton Sinclair was saying, he's trying to bring awareness to the plight of immigrants, and he actually brings awareness to how disgusting these meat packing plants are. And so his quote was, "I aimed for the public's heart and I hit it in the stomach." There is a lot of religious basis to this reform, and these people were a part of the social gospel movement. The social gospel movement wants to use Christian ideals as the foundation for this reform and to apply Christian ethics and standards to social problems of poverty, crime, alcoholism, slums that they live in, bad hygiene, poor schools, dangers of war, and economic inequality. And from the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, that is where they're taking their motivation from. So these Christians are urging to end child labor and the dangers of it and want a shorter work week for everyone. And churches already are centers of the community in providing support and help to those who are in need, so they basically want to expand that. One way of doing that was through settlement houses. Think of a settlement house as like a sort of YMCA. It's a community center that provides services to urban poor, and they do childcare classes for mothers. They provide nursery schools for children, kindergarten. They teach English. They have art programs and dance programs for adults. So it is basically like a YMCA. The most famous one is Hull House in Chicago in 1913. It's a famous settlement house started by the reformer Jane Addams. And her success, not only as a reformer, but as a woman reformer, inspires other college-educated middle-class women to become social workers. To reform child labor, individual states begin banning child labor, and in 1916, the federal government passes the Keating-Owens Act, which bans child labor outright, but the Supreme Court rules it unconstitutional. You shouldn't be able to interfere with a person's right to work. So instead of banning child labor, states start passing laws that require children to attend school until a certain age. So because of these two things, the number of children working drops and the number of children in school rises considerably. And you can see that from these graphs here. Right around 1900, the number of children employed starts to dip sharply throughout the first 30 years in the 1900s. To reform industrial plants and places, one of the most horrible workplace accidents ever that forces them to do this is the March 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City. And it kills 146 workers because the managers left them there, mostly women immigrants, left them there in order to keep them working, to make a profit. They ignored the dangers of the fire. And the fire spread so quickly that they found skeletons that were bending over sewing machines. And so progressives call for reform. Workplaces are made safer. Workers who are hurt will now get workers' compensation. They won't just be fired and thrown to the side. And they also limited the workday to 10 hours. But again, the Supreme Court and the government really doesn't want to do that. So Lochner versus New York declares limiting this workday unconstitutional. And then finally, the election rules and the primaries, the reforms in government. These are all meant to make government more democratic. So in a direct primary, citizens vote for the nominees of a general election. In Indiana, those are held in May. So in May, Democrats will go vote for who they want the Democratic nominee to be for each office. There might be 3 or 4 people running to be the Democratic nominee. Before, the party used to just choose, but now citizens vote for the nominees. An initiative is something that puts a proposed new law on a ballot by collecting signatures on a petition. So let's say you get 10,000 signatures. The new law that you want passed gets put on a ballot, and then the people vote for it. A referendum is citizens being able to approve and reject laws that have already been passed by the legislature. And then the recall is having the power to remove a public official from office before their term is ended because they're doing such a horrible job. And then lastly, the commission system is put into place in 1900 because a huge hurricane, one of the biggest on record, wipes out Galveston, Texas. And so the city replaces the mayor with a city commission, which is more efficient. And this becomes known as the Galveston Plan. And then people coming out of this local and state government, like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, will later bring this progressivism attitude to the White House. That's all I have for you today. That's just the beginning of progressivism. We're going to talk more about women and minorities, and we will get into that here in a little bit. So fill out those learning targets, bring them back to class, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.